Boldwood presents Betrayal, written by Kerry Kaya and read by Annie Aldington. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Tracey Tempest had never been the type of woman to keep her opinions to herself, especially when it came to her mother-in-law, Patricia. But seeing as she had a garden full of guests, today of all days she was begrudgingly prepared to make an exception, if for no other reason than to keep the peace. After all, the very last thing she wanted to do was cause a scene on her husband Terry's birthday. Brunette and petite, and with a penchant for wearing leopard print, Tracey was a beautiful woman. But as she moved around her immaculate fitted oak kitchen, lifting tin foil away from plates of ham sandwiches, sausage rolls, and large bowls filled with salad, she gritted her teeth into a scowl. "Why don't you get out from under my feet and go outside, Pat?" she urged her mother-in-law, with a flick of her head towards the garden, where Terry's 50th surprise birthday party was already in full swing. "Terry will be here at any moment, and I'll be bringing the cake out soon," she said with a glance at her watch. "And you wouldn't want to miss out on that, would you?" Patricia turned up her nose as she eyed the single-tiered ice sponge cake with a measure of distaste. In the middle of the thick white icing, 2 red candles bearing the numbers 5 and 0 had been pushed haphazardly into the sponge. "Cake?" she remarked in a loud, shrill voice. "Is that what you bleedin' well call it? I told you I would have baked the cake myself, and believe me, it would have been a darn sight better than this monstrosity." She flicked a remnant piece of icing away from the gold-coloured cake board and onto the worktop. "But oh no, my baking wasn't good enough for you, was it?" She paused to catch her breath and squinted to look up at the clock on the wall. The alcohol she'd already sunk, making it difficult for her to focus. "Besides, it's a bit early, ain't it? You've not even brought out the buffet yet." Tracey closed her eyes, then silently counted to 10 before answering. In her mind, the sooner Terry put in an appearance and the cake could be served, the sooner one of her sons could drop their grandmother off home, and the real party could begin. "Well, go and spend some time with the guests then." She gestured impatiently in the direction of the many family and friends who were gathered in the garden. "What do you want to be cooped up inside with me for?" For a few moments, Patricia was thoughtful as she patted her peroxide blonde hair that she'd painstakingly backcombed to within an inch of its life. "What time did you tell Kenny to get Terry here for?" Her blue eyes twinkled as she asked the question. Kenny Kempton was not only her son's childhood friend, but he was also Terry's business partner, and it was no secret that Patricia had a soft spot for him. Taking a second glance at her watch, Tracey took note of the time. She'd told Kenny to make sure he brought Terry home for 2 o'clock, and with just a few moments to spare, she still needed to finish setting up the buffet. "They're due any minute, so why don't you go outside and wait for them?" Tracey said, ushering her mother-in-law out of the kitchen. Patricia all but skipped out the back door, her slim body practically jigging from side to side with excitement as she tottered outside on impossibly high stilettos. Heaving a sigh of relief, Tracey shook her head and resumed the task of tearing away sheets of tinfoil from the finger buffet. Her mother-in-law's cloying scent still filled the kitchen, and wrinkling her nose, she waved her arm in the air to help clear the stench. "Was Nan giving you grief again?" As he strode into the kitchen, a hint of amusement could be heard in Ricky Tempest's voice. The hostile relationship between his mother and grandmother was legendary on their estate, and it was fair to say there was no love lost between the two women. To be more precise, they despised each other, and had done so from the very first moment they'd clapped eyes on one another. Throwing the discarded sheets of tin foil into the bin, Tracey looked up at her eldest son and rolled her eyes. "As much as I love your father," she sighed, "if I'd have known back then that I would have to put up with his mother day in and day out, I would never have agreed to marry the man." Ricky chuckled out loud. For all her talk, he knew for a fact his mother adored his father and would be lost without him. His parents were not only a match made in heaven, but also had the kind of marriage that he and his younger brother Jamie could only hope to one day emulate. "Do me a favour, darling. As soon as the cake has been eaten, take your Nan home." She tapped the side of her head. "There is only so much I can take of her in one day without blowing a gasket. And believe me, it's taking every ounce of my strength not to wrap my hands around her throat and throttle the life out of her." "Will do." Ricky chuckled even harder. Shifting his weight slightly, he cleared his throat and became serious. "I'm thinking of popping the question to Kayla." Tracey's mouth dropped open. "What, here? Today?" she asked. Ricky shrugged, and as his 3-year-old son Mason ran into the kitchen, he was saved from answering. "Oh, go on, do it today." Tracey beamed up at her son. "We'll make sure it's one of the biggest celebrations this estate has ever seen. We'll put on the works, a proper East End knees-up. And as for your dad," she said with a laugh, "he can pay for the bloody lot. It's about time the bugger came in useful for something," she said. "She hasn't even said yes yet, Mum," Ricky reminded his mother. "Oh, she'll say yes. Don't you worry about that." Peering through the kitchen window, Tracey spotted her son's girlfriend Kayla attempting to make small talk with Patricia, and loved the woman even more for her effort. She, of all people, knew just how difficult it was to get a decent conversation out of her mother-in-law. "That girl loves the bleeding bones of you, and it's about time you made it official, made her a Tempest. She's already one of the family, and she's got a good head on her shoulders too." "We'll see," Ricky answered, as he scooped his son up into his arms, before he could swipe one of the iced fairy cakes that his mother had set out on a cake stand just moments earlier. "Oh, let him have one. There's plenty to go around." Peeling away the paper casing, Tracey passed across one of the cakes, and as her grandson took a large bite, she gave him a playful wink. "Just remember to keep stum about it for now, Mum. I don't want Kayla catching wind of it before I've even had the chance to get down on one knee and propose." Tracey chuckled, and leaning in towards her son, she pretended to pull a zip across her lips. "I'm the queen of keeping stum, and believe me, if I can keep quiet about the skullduggery your father has been involved in over the years, then I think I can keep a lid on this," she said. With an impending wedding on the horizon, even Pat's presence wasn't enough to dampen Tracey's mood, and with another glance at her watch, she wondered for the umpteenth time that afternoon if it was too early to bring out the birthday cake, and, more to the point, where was her husband? She bit down on her lip. It was so typical of Terry. He'd be late for his own funeral. Not that she entirely blamed him, considering he had no idea about the party. But Kenny, on the other hand, now he did know, and more than once she had specifically instructed him to make sure that he brought Terry home on time. In quick succession, Kenny Kempton snorted 2 lines of cocaine from a compact disc. "This," he said with an approving nod, "is the fucking bollocks." Beside him, in the passenger seat, Terry Tempest grinned. "I told you it's the nuts, and believe me, there's plenty more where that came from." A 6'2" in height, Terry was not only a handsome man with dark brown hair, hazel eyes and a chiselled jawline, but he also had a muscular physique and menacing presence about him, all of which his 2 sons had inherited. Licking his index finger, Kenny greedily gathered up the remnant traces of cocaine and rubbed them across his gums. Then, looking up at the rearview mirror, he set about wiping away the excess white powder from around his nostrils before smoothing down his greying hair. Unlike Terry, he was a portly man and a good 3 inches shorter than his business partner. The only thing he and Terry shared in common was the fact that they could both hold their own. Even as children, they had inflicted fear and intimidation amongst their classmates. They'd ruled the playground in pretty much the same way as they ruled Dagenham, with brute force. Up ahead of them, a white transit van turned into the breaker's yard that Kenny and Terry owned. Kenny waited until the van had pulled up beside them before leaning across Terry, pulling open the glove box and taking out a loaded semi-automatic pistol. "What took you so long?" he demanded, as he stepped outside the car, his gruff voice loud and harsh. Kenny's son, Sean, jumped out of the van, his plump cheeks flushed pink, and ran a hand through his blonde hair, making it stand up on end. "Bianca," he spat. "Her and the rest of the Murphys are threatening to up the price. Reckon they're sick and tired of babysitting the merchandise." Kenny narrowed his eyes. Bianca, or the bitch, as he'd nicknamed her, was beginning to get right on his tits. And as for the rest of the Murphys clan, not only were they the equivalent of snarling dogs, but they were severely lacking when it came to brain cells. They had no sense for business, a fact which should have sent alarm bells ringing in Kenny's ears long before he and Terry had finalised any form of deal with them. He cocked his head towards the van. "What about the goods?" "All present and correct," Sean grinned. Moving around the van, he glanced over his shoulder, checking that the coast was clear, then set about unlocking the rear doors. "She said they want double the price next time. Otherwise, the deal's off." Passing the gun across to his son, Kenny gave a nasty chuckle. As far as he was concerned, Bianca and the rest of her family could go fuck themselves. Not only had they laid out the terms of their business transaction, but they'd also shaken on it, and like fuck were the Murphys going to double back on their word 6 months down the line. Not unless they wanted to cause serious ructions. "You need to sort her out," he growled, giving Terry a sidelong glance. "The bitch is getting above her station." Despite the flash of anger that tore through him, Terry could see Kenny's point, and so begrudgingly gave a nod of his head. As of late, Bianca had begun making more and more demands, not only on their business deals, but also on him. She didn't like to share, and on more than one occasion had let it be known that she wanted Terry all to herself. Terry didn't have the heart to tell her that that wasn't how he was made. He already had a wife, Tracey, or his Trace, as he affectionately called her. Tracey was a good woman and a blinding mother to their 2 sons. But as much as he loved her, he also liked a bit of variety. Always had done. In fact, before the ink had even dried on their wedding certificate, he'd shagged one of Tracey's bridesmaids in the gents' toilets where they'd held their wedding reception. As for Bianca, he'd been seeing her on the side for the past 6 months. It wasn't the first time that he played away from home, and certainly wouldn't be the last. But for the time being, he was more than happy to string Bianca along. She had all the attributes that he liked in a woman. Not only was she beautiful, but more importantly, she was good in the sack. Still, as good as Bianca was between the sheets, it wasn't enough to tempt him to leave Tracey. And even if he did, give it a month or 2, and he would be up to his old tricks again, shagging other women. It was who he was. He couldn't change, even if he wanted to. After all, a leopard never changed its spots, did it? Only Bianca was too dense to realise this. With the van doors now unlocked, the 3 men peered eagerly inside. Huddled towards the rear, 4 women looked fearfully out at them, their bodies trembling, their faces pale, and their eyes wide and terror-stricken. Kenny looked the women over. Despite himself, he was somewhat impressed. Not only were they all young, slim and fair-haired, but from what he could see of them, they were also clean. Unlike the last shipment of whores the Murphys had sent their way. Not only had the women looked ropey, but they'd stunk to high heaven. In fact, they'd looked so dog-rough that Kenny had been hell-bent on taking a trip to Bianca's flat with a sawn-off shotgun in tow to have it out with the bitch. He would have done too, if it hadn't been for Terry smoothing the situation over. Months it had taken for them to recoup the money they'd paid out for the tarts, a fact that Terry wasn't going to take lying down. The Murphys had taken the piss out of them, and that was the understatement of the century. "Out!" Kenny ordered, waving his arm in the air in an attempt to make himself understood. Cowering away from him, the petrified women clung to one another, their cries of fear becoming louder and more desperate by the passing second. "Come on, get out!" Never one to have much patience, Terry jumped up into the van, yanked a woman to her feet, then shoved her none too gently towards the open doors. As the women were frog-marched through the front door of a run-down house that was positioned towards the rear of the remote breaker's yard, their frantic cries for help fell upon deaf ears. "What are they saying?" Tilting his head to one side, Sean studied the women through narrowed eyes. "How the fuck would I know?" Terry pointed out, as he pushed a terrified woman towards the wooden staircase, which led up to where the bedrooms were situated. "Do I look like I speak Slovakian or Romanian, or wherever the fuck it is they've come from?" Sean shrugged. For all they knew, the women could be telling them they were riddled with every venereal disease known to man. The mere thought was enough to make him shudder. Twirling the van key around his index finger, Sean backed out of the house. "I'll go and fill the van up with petrol and meet you at the party." Locking eyes with his son, Kenny raised his eyebrows. "Don't be late," he warned, his voice holding a hint of menace. "You wouldn't want to miss out on the festivities, now would you?" His gaze drifting back to Terry, Sean solemnly shook his head before bolting out of the door. An hour later, as he turned the car off the A13 and drove towards Dagenham, Kenny gave a disgruntled shake of his head. Despite the wealth he and Terry had accumulated over the years, Terry had refused point-blank to leave the estate where they had grown up, fully believing that staying in the area would keep his two sons grounded. He hadn't wanted them to grow up to become pompous, spoiled, arrogant bastards. No, he'd wanted them to graft for their dough, had wanted them to know the value of money, and, more importantly, had wanted them to know where they had come from. In Kenny's eyes, the notion was ludicrous, and at the first opportunity he'd upped and left the council estate and bought himself a detached house in Elm Park. And as far as Kenny was concerned, his own son had turned out all right, considering he'd not only grown up in a more affluent area, but that he'd also attended a private school. The school fees alone had been crippling, and he'd almost needed to take out a mortgage just to pay for the uniform. But it had been worth it. His boy had had the best education that money could pay for. Fair enough, Sean didn't have the same menacing presence about him that Terry's two boys had, but he could still hold his own, and would still be able to have a tear-up as and when he needed to. Still shaking his head, Kenny tutted loudly as he looked around him. "This place never changes," he stated. "It was a shithole back in the day and it's still a shithole today." Beside him, Terry lit a cigarette and gave a nonchalant shrug, already bored with the conversation. Anyone would think that Kenny had been born with a silver spoon in his mouth the way he carried on. "It ain't that bad. Let's face it. The place never did us any harm, did it?" "Not that bad," Kenny sneered. "Look around you. They should have bulldozed this place to the ground years ago." Moments later, Kenny brought the car to a halt outside the house Terry owned. As much as he hated to admit it, his friend had done wonders with the place. In fact, the house wouldn't have looked out of place in his neck of the woods, and considering he'd paid just under £500,000 for his gaff, that was saying something. Unclipping his seatbelt, he turned his head. "Remember to act surprised," he said, nodding towards the house. "Tracey will have my guts if she finds out I let slip about the party." Groaning out loud, Terry unclipped his seatbelt and stepped out of the car. Tracey knew that he loathed surprises, and as his birthday had approached, he'd warned her time and time again not to spring a surprise party on him. In his mind, he could think of nothing worse, and would have much preferred an evening out of the dogs, followed by a meal in a curry house. On seeing Terry's expression, Kenny chuckled. "Just smile in all the right places," he suggested, as he sprung open the car boot. "And with a bit of luck, she won't be any the wiser." Retrieving a velvet-lined wooden box containing a 26-year-old bottle of Glenfiddich that he'd tossed into the boot earlier that afternoon, Kenny grinned. He'd paid a hefty price for the whiskey, and when he handed the gift over to Terry, he hoped that his generosity would be noted by more than one person. In fact, he was counting on it. Before Terry could even pull his keys out of his pocket, the front door was flung open, and standing there on the doorstep was Tracey, her hands on her hips and a scowl across her beautiful face. As always, she looked immaculate, not a single hair out of place, her slim figure encased in a fitted cream dress with leopard print piping around the neckline. "Where the bleeding hell have you been?" She directed her question at Kenny, who had the grace to look sheepish. 2:00, I said." Taking a quick glance at his watch, Kenny shrugged, It was almost 4. "We had car trouble," he said by way of an explanation. The truth was, they would have arrived much earlier if Terry hadn't insisted on sampling the merchandise before leaving the breaker's yard. Not that he could tell his friend's wife this. As it was, she had no idea of what her husband got up to behind her back. Fidelity wasn't a word in Terry's vocabulary. The fact he was married made no odds to him. He was a randy bastard whose main goal in life was to screw as many women as he possibly could. The only stipulation he had was that the woman in question still had her own teeth and a pulse. "More like you were in the boozer." Tracey rolled her eyes. "Some surprise party this has turned out to be," she said, leading the men into the kitchen. "And your mother's been chomping at the bloody bit waiting for you to arrive. Here, tell." She smoothed down her dress and gestured towards the iced sponge cake. "Now that you're here, shall I bring the cake out? Get it over and done with?" "Bit early, ain't it?" Shaking his head, Terry afforded his wife a knowing grin. "I've only just got here. Give it another hour or two, sweetheart," he said, slinging his arm around his wife's petite frame and squeezing her towards him. "My old mum will fuck off soon enough, and then you can let your hair down and relax." Tracey's cheeks flushed pink. Terry had always been able to see right through her, and so he should, considering they'd been together since they were teenagers. In fact, it would be fair to say that he knew her inside and out, especially when it came to the strained relationship between her and his mother. It was just one of the many reasons why she loved him so much. He understood how difficult Patricia could be, and had never once tried to excuse his mother's poor behaviour. Not only had they grown up together, but they'd also built a life together, and had raised 2 wonderful sons. How could she not love him? Terry was her everything. She worshipped the ground he walked on, and had done so from the very first moment she'd clapped her eyes on him. Picking up her wineglass, she took a long sip. "I'm going to hold you to that," she laughed between mouthfuls. "2 hours tops, and then I'm bringing this cake out if it's the last thing I ever do." Amid a raucous cheer, Terry stepped out into the garden and gave his best impression of feigning surprise. A glass of his favourite tipple, whisky, was thrust into his hand, and a Cuban cigar into the other. As he lit up and took several short, sharp puffs, Terry grinned happily. He may not like surprises, but he could see just how much effort his wife had put into organising the party, and loved her even more for it, even if that was in his own haphazard way. Minutes later, Terry began opening an array of gifts. Taking the wooden box from Kenny, he opened it to reveal a bottle of vintage whisky inside. "Fuck me! This must have set you back a few quid," Terry exclaimed, as he whistled through his teeth. Taking pride of place beside her son, Patricia gasped out loud. She may not have been much of a drinker, but even she could see the gift hadn't been something that Kenny had picked up last minute from the local supermarket. No, she'd bet her life on it that a great deal of care and thought had gone into the present. "You're a good man, you are, Kenny." Patricia beamed up at him. "Your old mum would have been proud of you." As Kenny waved the comments away, he couldn't help but smirk as he looked around him to see if anyone else had witnessed the elaborate gesture. He loved nothing more than to flaunt his wealth, and actually got a kick out of others knowing that he was loaded, that splashing out over £500 on a bottle of whisky meant nothing to him. 2 hours later, Tracey ever so carefully tottered out of the house in a pair of leopard print stilettos. In her hands, she held the birthday cake, complete with the lit candles that flickered precariously in the light breeze. "Happy birthday, my darling!" Placing the cake on the patio table in front of her husband, Tracey stood on her tiptoes to plant a kiss on Terry's lips, savouring the familiar pull of him. Even after 30 years of marriage, she couldn't get enough of him, and still to this day could hand on heart state that he was the only man for her. Oh, they'd had their ups and downs, of course they had. What couples didn't? But still she was unable to envisage a future for herself without him by her side. And if truth were told, she didn't want to. "Make a wish, Grandad." Barely able to contain his excitement, Mason jumped up and down. Laughing heartily, Terry hauled his grandson up onto his shoulders, whispered into the little boy's ear, then leant forward so that together they could blow out the candles. Amidst cheers and shouts for a speech, Terry grinned. He plonked his grandson on the floor, picked up his glass, then swallowed down a large gulp of the whiskey. "Come on, Dad," his youngest son Jamie called out to him. "Give us a speech." "All right," Terry called back to his son good-naturedly. "Give me a fucking chance." He cleared his throat, and as he opened his mouth to deliver the much-requested speech, a deafening gunshot resonated through the air. Pandemonium broke out, and as the terrified guests ran for cover, shock was etched across Terry's handsome face. Staggering forward, he reached around to clasp at his back. The sharp, piercing pain just below his shoulder blades was enough to alert him to the fact that he'd taken a hit, and as warm, sticky blood seeped through his fingers, staining the white linen shirt he wore crimson, the high-pitched, piercing scream that came from Tracey rang loud in his ears. As he locked eyes with his wife, Terry's lips ever so slightly parted before his eyes rolled to the back of his head, and he crashed face first to the floor, bringing the glass table, birthday cake, and the gift box containing the expensive bottle of whiskey down on top of him. Chapter 2. The funeral of Terry Tempest was a large, sombre affair, and as 4 magnificent black horses pulled a glass carriage through the streets towards St. Margaret's Church in Barking, onlookers lined the pavements and craned their necks, to not only get a better view of the solid redwood coffin, but also to catch a glimpse of the grieving widow. For the entire journey, Tracey had kept her head facing forward, her gaze remaining focused on the carriage that contained her husband's body. She was still unable to comprehend that Terry was gone from her life. Her heart had shattered into a million tiny pieces that day, the pain she felt ripping through her mind and body at a pace that almost took her breath away. "It's going to be okay, Mum." Beside her, Jamie clutched her cold, tiny hand in his. "We're going to get through this." Without answering, Tracey bit down on her lip in an attempt to fight down the urge to scream at her son, to tell him that she would never be okay again, that a piece of her heart had died with her husband, and that each and every time she closed her eyes, the horrifying scene as Terry took his last breath still haunted her. Instead, she gave Jamie's hand a gentle squeeze back. Her boys meant well. After all, they too were grieving the loss of their father, the man they'd looked up to their entire lives, and as much as they would understand her outburst, it would be unfair of her to take her grief out on them. As expected, the church was filled to the rafters. Tracey took a seat in the front pew, flanked on either side by her 2 sons. From directly behind her, she could hear the pitiful sobs that came from Patricia. There and then her heart went out to her mother-in-law. She may not have been Pat's biggest fan, but even she knew the loss of her only child would hit the woman hard. It was bound to. For the past 50 years, Terry had been the mainstay of Patricia's life, her sole purpose for waking up in the morning. Many times over the years, Tracey had heard her mother-in-law recount with a measure of pride how as a single mother she'd worked 2 jobs just so that she could keep a roof over her and her sons' heads and put food in his belly. Very little had been known about Terry's father, other than he'd originated from Liverpool and had been a travelling salesman. Tracey had often wondered if Pat herself had even known who Terry's father was. She'd heard enough stories over the years to know that in her youth her mother-in-law had been considered a good-time girl, who'd always been up for some fun. Not that she had ever broached the subject with Pat to find out if the rumours were true, least of all with Terry himself. The church service had been a long-winded affair, and as much as Tracey had wanted to bolt out of her seat, flee from the church and gulp fresh air into her lungs, another part of her had not wanted the service to come to an end, knowing full well that when it did, Terry's body would be interred into the ground, forever out of her reach. 40 minutes later, as the mourners made their way out of the cemetery gates and headed across the road in the direction of the Captain Cook public house, where the wake was being held, they offered Tracey their condolences. Dutifully, she gave them a tight smile in return and thanked them for paying their respects. I'm sorry for your loss. Terry was a good man. Tracey glanced up to look at a young woman and was momentarily taken aback. The makeup she wore had been plastered on so thickly that Tracey wouldn't have been surprised if she'd used a trowel to apply her foundation. Her full pink lips were glossy, her dark eyebrows a startling contrast compared to the thick blonde hair which framed her face. The words should have been said with sincerity, but to Tracey's ears there had been a lack of warmth in the woman's voice. As the woman walked away, Tracey's gaze followed her with interest. "Who's that woman?" she asked. Ricky turned his head in time to witness Bianca Murphy and Kenny share a few words. "That's Bianca Murphy," he answered. Narrowing his eyes, Ricky gave a shrug. He hadn't even known that his dad was on friendly terms with the Murphys. He'd certainly never heard Terry have a good word to say about them. It was well known that the family were thugs, that they were given a wide berth by those who were unfortunate enough to know them, and Terry had more than made his opinion of the family known. He'd regarded them as scum, a drain on society, a sentiment which was widely agreed on by the locals. For a few moments, Tracey continued watching her husband's best friend and Bianca, and as they turned to look in her direction, Tracey looked away, reminding herself to ask Kenny about the interaction at some point during the wake. "He's really gone, isn't he?" Patricia cried. "My boy is dead!" Pulling Patricia into his arms, Kenny whispered words of comfort. He could understand Patricia's disbelief of her son's death. Terry had been a larger-than-life character, and his absence would be a large void to fill, even for Kenny. Ever since they'd been kids, he and Terry had been the best of mates. They had done everything together, from fighting in the playground to fighting on the football terraces to finally making a name for themselves on the streets. They not only had reputations as hard men, but they were also both feared and well respected within the community. It would even be fair to say that they ruled Dagenham with an iron fist. Nothing went down without their prior approval, and every drug sold on the streets went through them first. "I mean, who would have done such a thing?" Patricia continued to cry. "I wish I knew, darling," Kenny lied. Despite his and Terry's close friendship, in recent months, Terry had become the equivalent of an albatross hanging from around Kenny's neck. They were meant to have been partners, best mates even, but oh no, it was Terry who wanted to run the show, and he threw his weight around left, right and centre, fully expecting everyone around him to jump to his attention and toe the line, Kenny included. Take the deal with the Murphys, for example. It had been Kenny's suggestion to do business with Bianca and her brothers. They were so dense that it wouldn't take much work on his part to pull the wool over their eyes. Yet within days of negotiating the deal, Terry had taken over, shouting the odds as per fucking usual. And to make matters worse, Kenny's gut instinct had told him that between them, Terry and the bitch were keeping him out of the loop. In other words, there was a lot more money being made than either one of them were letting on. Patricia's sobs broke Kenny's reverie, and as her shoulders heaved, he pulled her even closer. "I still can't get my head around it." He blew out his cheeks and made a show of wiping away a solitary false tear. "He was cut down in the prime of his life. And believe me, darling, when I get my hands on the culprits responsible, I'm going to string 'em up by their fucking bollocks. They'll pay for what they did. You just wait and see." "You always were a good friend to him." Patricia's sobs turned to hiccups, and as she downed the remainder of her drink, she swayed on her feet, feeling somewhat tipsy. "Even as children, the two of you were as thick as thieves." Motioning towards the barmaid for another round of drinks, Kenny leant against the bar. "Terry was a good man," he stated. "I would have done anything for him. Fucking anything." He pocketed his change, then passed across a glass of white wine, all the while studying Patricia, knowing for a fact that he was only telling her everything she wanted to hear. "And you did and all." Patricia took a long sip of her wine. "Look at that bottle of whiskey you bought him for his birthday. He was made up with it." Fresh tears stung her eyes, and she began to sob even harder. "He never even got the chance to open the bottle." Kenny forced away the smug grin that threatened to spread across his face. As much as the whiskey had been an elaborate gesture, he was also banking on the fact that the gift would help cement his innocence. After all, what man in his right mind would shell out over 500 knicker for a present, all the while knowing that he was planning to bump the recipient off? They'd have to be crazy, wouldn't they? At least this was the conclusion that he hoped the old Bill would come to. As it was, the filth had been sniffing around a little too much for his liking, and Tracey, the stupid cow, was actually encouraging them. She'd even told him that she rang the police station several times each day just for an update, hoping that by some miracle they would tell her they had caught the culprit responsible for Terry's death. It was ludicrous, really. The old Bill didn't care about the likes of them. He'd even heard more than one whisper through the grapevine that the filth had thrown a party when they'd heard that Terry had been gunned down. It was a case of one less face on the streets as far as they were concerned. "Looks like your Sean's had a skinful." Kenny snapped his head up. "Your Sean," Patricia reiterated, as she dabbed a sodden tissue to her eyes. "He's 3 sheets to the wind." Kenny turned his attention to his son. Across the far side of the pub, Sean was swaying unsteadily on his feet, the contents of his pint glass sloshing over both the floor and any unsuspecting mourners within close proximity. Irritation swept through Kenny's veins, and as he shot a surreptitious glance towards Terry's sons, anger filled him. Unlike Sean, Ricky and Jamie Tempest sat dutifully beside their mother, their hard eyes watching everything that went on around them. They were alert, just as their father had always been, and no matter how much booze they sank, Kenny knew that they would remain on their guard. From an early age, it had been ingrained in them that they were Tempests, and that meant there was always some bastard out there ready and waiting to have a pop at them. Slamming his glass down on the bar, Kenny made his way across the pub, and grasping his son by the elbow, he pulled Sean round to face him. "You're pissed," Kenny hissed in his ear. As he looked up at his father, Sean staggered on his feet. His eyes were glassy, his skin pale, and his lips pinched. "It's a wake, ain't it?" he slurred. "I'm entitled to have a drink." He belched loudly and refocused his gaze on his father. "And if anyone's allowed to have a drink, it should be me," he said, stabbing a stiff finger into his chest, his lips suddenly curling down at the corners. "I deserve it after what I did. After what you made me do." His expression becoming murderous, Kenny shoved his son towards the exit. The pint glass slipped from Sean's fingers and smashed to smithereens on the hard wooden floor, causing several mourners to turn their heads at the commotion. Once outside the pub, Kenny's breath streamed out ahead of him as he slammed his only son roughly up against the brickwork. "Listen here, you little fucker," he snarled. "Watch your mouth. Do you understand me?" Sean flinched, and as he brought his arms protectively up towards his head, he cowered away from his father. The action only served to fuel Kenny's anger. "Do you understand me?" Kenny growled, his voice low and menacing. Sean swallowed deeply, and blinking rapidly up at his father, he choked out a reply. "I'm sorry, Dad." Tears filled his eyes, and he hastily wiped them away, not wanting to give his dad even more ammunition or another reason to lash out at him. Kenny taking his anger out on his son was nothing new, only he didn't usually do it out in public. After all, he had an image to maintain, and being an abuser of women and children didn't go down too well in his world. Outwardly, father and son appeared close. After all, Sean was Kenny's only child, his rightful heir and namesake. The reality, however, was very different. Kenny had a vicious streak inside of him, and the fact Sean was his son meant nothing. In fact, Sean had lost count of the number of times Kenny had taken his fists or his belt to him. The belt being Kenny's favourite form of punishment. He even kept a worn leather belt hanging up on a hook in the hallway to serve as a constant reminder of what would happen should his son disobey him. Kenny had even had the front to call the beatings tough love, claiming that it would harden Sean up, that it would turn him into a man. "I can't help it," Sean cried, pointing to his temple. "What I did is up here, and it won't go away. It's eating away at me. I can't think of anything else. It's suffocating me. I killed him. I murdered Terry." Gripping his son by the jaw, Kenny forced Sean to look at him. "Forget about him," he implored. "Terry was having me over. Him and that bitch were raking it in, and were trying to treat me like a fucking muppet. You know it and I know it. And that, he said with a shake of his head, is not something I was prepared to let slip. Terry deserved everything he had coming to him. Sean swallowed deeply, and his concerned gaze shot towards the pub. But what if they find out it was me? As he followed his son's gaze, Kenny screwed up his face. Who? He demanded, genuinely perplexed. Ricky and Jamie, Sean answered, fear clearly evident in his voice. Stepping away from his son, Kenny shook his head and let out a low chuckle. They won't, he reassured him. Sean's voice took on a desperate measure. You know what they're like. They've got too much of Terry inside of them to be any different. They're like dogs with a bone once they've set their minds to something, and they're not stupid. They keep looking at me, he complained. They know what I did, that it was me. And what about... Beads of cold sweat broke out across Sean's forehead. What if they want in on the business? You know, the women, he whispered. Or what if they go to the old Bill? The filth would throw the book at us. They'll start snooping around. They'd question us. They'd question me. What if the old Bill suss out the truth, that it was me who killed Terry? I'd go to prison, and I can't, he cried. I can't do time, Dad. You know that. I wouldn't cope. I'd fall apart. Dismissing his son's fears, Kenny rolled his eyes before glancing around him to check that no one else was within earshot of their conversation. Trust me, he said, his voice low. Ricky and Jamie are clueless. They know fuck all about the shooting. And as for the tarts, do you really think that Terry would have involved them in something like that? Unconvinced, Sean took a deep breath. You don't know that for certain, Dad, he began. Yes, I do. Slinging his arm around his son's shoulders, Kenny nodded towards the pub. Terry didn't want the boys involved. He wouldn't have wanted them to know that his and Tracey's marriage was nothing other than a sham. At least on his part, anyway. I'm not sure the same can be said about Tracey. You know as well as I do that he'd fuck anything with a pulse. He afforded Sean a wide grin. Now sober the fuck up before you end up causing us a shitload of aggro. Is everything okay out here? Both Kenny and Sean swung their heads round in time to see Ricky step outside the pub, his head tilted to one side as he studied them. Yeah, Kenny grinned. He jerked his thumb towards his son and gave a wink. He's had a bit too much sherbet, if you get my drift. Ricky Tempest narrowed his eyes. It's my old man's funeral, he said, taking a step closer. My mum is already in bits, so rein it in a bit, yeah? I don't want her any more upset than she already is. The abrupt way in which Ricky spoke rankled Kenny, making his back instantly stiffen. It was like listening to Terry bark out his orders all over again. Resisting the urge to tell his friend's son to fuck off, Kenny held up his hands, his expression becoming one of mock contrition. He'll behave himself. Don't you worry about that. I've already given him a talking to. Giving a satisfied nod of his head, Ricky retreated back inside the pub. As he watched Ricky go, Kenny's eyes became hard slits, and his lips curled into a snarl. Who does a little fucker think he is, eh? Telling me? He poked himself in the chest. To rein it in? Like I'm no one? Like I'm some kind of mug? The prick needs to remember who he's talking to. I was having tear-ups before he was even a twinkle in his old man's eyes. Shrugging, Sean made the wise decision to keep his mouth firmly closed. The last thing he wanted to do was rile his father up even further than was necessary. As it was, he had a feeling that his dad was already teetering on the edge of sanity. He had to be, if he truly believed that they could get away with murdering Terry Tempest without bringing any repercussions on themselves. As they walked back into the pub, Sean kept his head down low. Despite what Kenny thought of the two brothers, Ricky and Jamie were Tempests, through and through. They could be hard bastards when they needed to be. It was one of the many reasons why Terry had put them to work as enforcers, whereas he had been given the task of guarding the women they trafficked. It just about said it all, really, didn't it? Even his own father didn't believe he was capable of anything other than collecting the tarts from Bianca Murphy. And to make matters even worse, Sean knew it too. The problem was, he hadn't had the same upbringing as his father or the Tempests. While he'd been learning Latin at private school, Ricky and Jamie had been learning their trade by getting into scraps in the playground. Their worlds were poles apart, and it was only now, with the fear of Ricky and Jamie's wrath hanging over Sean's head, that this fact bothered him. Once he'd returned to his seat, Ricky nodded towards his brother, indicating that he'd had a word in Kenny's ear. He was determined that nothing and no one would ruin his dad's send-off, and that included Kenny Kempton and his son. "Are you all right, Mum?" Grasping his mother's hand, Ricky gave a gentle squeeze. Tracey sighed. Picking up her wineglass, she took a long sip. How was she supposed to answer? Of course she wasn't all right. How could she be, when across the road in the churchyard her husband's corpse had been lowered into the ground, in what would become his final resting place? She still couldn't believe that Terry was gone, that she would never see